The child was born in shadows while the kingdom celebrated light. England had its prince, Edward VI, son of Henry and Jane Seymour. The line of succession was secured. And yet, somewhere beyond the sweep of court and crown, another boy opened his eyes for the first time, quieter, unnoticed. No banners flew. No bells rang. His mother bled alone in a stone chamber in Wiltshire, a midwife sworn to silence by coin and fear. When the child gave his first cry, it was not met with joy, but with swift containment. He was a Tudor, yes, but of the wrong arrangement. His name, whispered only among a few, was Edward. Like the king. Like the saint. But his surname was borrowed, never settled. Stafford, some said. Fitzroy, others dared. It did not matter. His blood would not be publicly acknowledged. His existence was inconvenient. He was the son of Henry VIII, born of a woman whose name never reached the pages of official history. A lady-in-waiting, some claimed. Others said she was of minor noble stock, seduced and discarded in the narrowing years of the king's virility. What mattered was not who she was, but that she had borne a child with the unmistakable stamp of Tudor across his brow. There were no grand halls for this Edward. He was not raised among Tudors and diplomats. He was not groomed to inherit the throne. Instead, he grew in the countryside, among pale grasses and stone walls, watched over by a man who claimed to be his uncle but spoke little and drank often. The boy learned early not to ask questions. Not to demand. Not to cry. He was instructed in Latin by an old priest who smelled of dust and resentment. He read the lives of saints and martyrs, but more often he lingered on histories of kings, especially those who were forgotten. There was something comforting about them. Men born into promise, consumed by politics, vanishing between the margins. He read until his eyes ached. Then he read more. By the time he was 10, he understood that he was different. Not for his intellect, nor his pale hair, but for the way adults grew silent when he entered a room. For the way letters arrived and disappeared without his seeing them. For the glances exchanged over his head. When he asked who his father was, he was told, a man of power. That was all. He learned to watch instead. To notice. The priest who once served at court and never mentioned it. The lady who visited in winter and wept when she saw him. The silver ring with the Tudor rose worn by a man who never gave his name. Edward saw, and catalogued, and stored every hint like currency. If he could not have truth, he would have observation. The years passed. Henry VIII died. His true son became king, a sickly boy with a scholar's eyes. Edward read about the coronation in a pamphlet weeks after it happened. He studied the portrait of his royal half-brother, younger than him by 2 years, and felt nothing. No jealousy. No longing. Just cold curiosity. At night, he would press his fingers to the mirror, tracing his own face. The high forehead. The sharp jaw. The same narrowed eyes as the ones in the paintings hung in noble houses across the kingdom. He did not doubt his blood. What he doubted was the silence. Because silence, he had learned, was more dangerous than any accusation. One spring, his guardian, the man who had raised him without warmth, collapsed at the foot of the stairs. A stroke, they said. Sudden and unkind. Edward stood over the body and felt a strange freedom creeping in behind the grief. For the first time, no one watched him sleep. No one burned his letters. No one told him what to do. So he wrote to the court. Not a demand. Not even a request. A question. carefully phrased, carefully delivered. But it returned unopened. No reply. Then came the warning, a thin man on horseback who dropped a scroll at the gate. It read only, "Leave well enough alone." And that was when Edward began to understand. He was not simply forgotten. He was erased. By 17, Edward Stafford had perfected the art of being unremarkable. He dressed in earth tones, spoke with deliberate restraint, and walked with the stooped posture of a clerk. But beneath the surface of his calculated modesty was something brittle, sharp, and quietly seething. He was a prince without a throne, an heir without a claim, and somewhere deep inside that truth festered like a bone-set realm. He still lived on the estate, now his by inheritance but never by title. No visitors arrived save the steward who delivered the rents and the occasional priest who offered dry sermons about humility and fate. But Edward did not believe in fate. Not anymore. Fate would have made him a king. This was design. Someone had decided that he was too dangerous to live openly and too real to be left completely free. He began to dig. Old letters. Ledgers. Legal records. He found mention of a payment made to a woman named in Weston in the year of his birth. A sum far too large for a servant. Then another document, sealed and signed, granting her quiet residence far from court. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded. But there it was. A thread. Thin, but real. And from there, he followed it. Through the years, he tracked names. Weston. Fitzroy. Aragon. Courtiers who vanished. Servants who married strangely well. He learned of one woman who had once spoken of a boy with the king's eyes and was found drowned in the Thames days later. He mapped it all in a small book bound in leather, hidden beneath the floorboards of his study. It became his secret gospel. And the more he uncovered, the more he understood the shape of the lie. He was not forgotten. He had been buried. The men who had served his father feared the blood in his veins more than any foreign power. If a child like him were to be acknowledged, it could splinter the realm once again. Better to silence him early. Let him rot in the countryside, harmless, alone. But Edward was no longer harmless. By 21, he had changed. His voice had deepened, tempered with the steel of restraint. His mind had sharpened with constant study, not of kings and lineages now, but of tactics, of manipulation, of philosophy. Machiavelli was not theory to him, it was prophecy. He saw how power could be hidden, disarmed, then unleashed with devastating calm. So he began to test the waters. A meeting with a disaffected cleric, arranged through a false name. A patronage to a printer known for dissent. A gift sent to a lady at court who had once been dismissed by Elizabeth's hand. Nothing overt. Nothing treasonous. But each move pushed against the boundaries that had been drawn for him. It did not go unnoticed. One morning, he returned from the village to find his study ransacked. Not looted, examined. His book was untouched, but shifted. A warning, carefully administered. And beside his inkwell, a white feather. Innocent, except Edward had once read in a buried dispatch that this was the symbol used by Walsingham's agents to mark potential threats. He burned every paper that night but one. The book remained. The truth mattered more than safety. After that, he changed tactics. Disappeared from view. For months, he lived in Norfolk under another name, watching the edges of the Protestant underground. He met men who whispered of change, of unrest, of dissatisfaction with the Virgin Queen's rule. And he said little, but listened well. And when one drunk nobleman slurred, there was another, a boy, said to be his, Edward only nodded, and made sure he remembered every name the man spoke. Yet through it all, he waited. Because patience had become his weapon. Not for glory. Not even for vengeance. But for the simple fact that he refused to be erased. And somewhere deep in his soul, the question began to turn on itself. What if he was not a victim? What if he had been made for something else entirely? The court of Elizabeth was a theater, all silk and daggers. Behind every smile, a calculation. Every bow, a deception. Edward Stafford entered it not as a nobleman but as a shadow wearing a borrowed name. He was called Edward Catesby now, a distant cousin of no particular importance. No one questioned him. That was the brilliance of his erasure. He could walk among them, invisible by design. He watched from corners. From behind goblets and fans. He saw the queen in her armor of powder and pearls, the illusion of youth painted atop weary bones. She was older than the realm admitted, her eyes ringed with years of ruling without trust. And she noticed him, not as a threat, not yet, but as something else. A curiosity. He made himself useful. Quietly, then pointedly. A whispered strategy here. A solved cipher there. Small acts, each laced with a little too much insight. And the queen, ever drawn to danger disguised as cleverness, summoned him at last. "You are sharp for a Catesby," she said, her fingers heavy with rings, her eyes shrewd. "What is it you want?" "Only to serve," he answered, and she smiled like a knife being drawn from velvet. It was not loyalty that kept him there. It was proximity. From within the walls of court, he could see the machinery of power, the letters passed hand to hand, the alliances shifting like tides. And beneath it all, the quiet hum of paranoia. The queen had no heir. The realm held its breath with every fever she suffered. Names were whispered in the dark: Mary, the Scots queen. James, her son. And others, too. Forgotten ones. That was when Edward made his move. He did not claim the throne. He merely hinted at blood. A passing reference to a lineage buried. A joke, half-voiced, about the red-gold hair he shared with portraits in the gallery. Enough to spark rumor. Enough to wake the hounds. And they came. First with gifts. Then with threats. One night, a message was slid beneath his chamber door: "You have been warned once." He burned it, unread. Another evening, he found the Queen's spymaster, not Walsingham, who had died, but a colder, less principled man, waiting in his room, holding a document Edward had never seen. A forged confession. Treason inked in his name. "You will leave court," the man said, calm as winter. "Or you will hang." Edward met his eyes and did not flinch. "There are other truths I could release," he said. "Old ones. Dead ones. Yours among them." It was a bluff. But the man paled. And so Edward was allowed to stay, but on shorter leash, under thicker watch. He had gambled. He had not lost. But he had drawn blood. From then on, he kept his ambitions in the dark, fed only by the pages of his hidden book and the bitter taste in his throat. He watched the queen grow older, thinner, more brittle. He watched noblemen bow while sharpening blades behind her back. He watched the realm drift toward uncertainty. And always, in his heart, that quiet truth: he could have been king. Not by divine right. Not by law. but by blood and fire and the sheer force of will. But he did not act. He could not. Not now. Because there was something else he had come to realize. Something darker. If he took the throne, if he bent history in his favor, he would not save England. He would become what they feared. And perhaps, he thought, they were right to fear him. The year Elizabeth died, the sky over London turned a dull, metallic grey, and the air hung heavy with unspoken things. The Queen's final breath echoed across a realm trembling with uncertainty. The Virgin Queen left no children, no official successor until her dying lips whispered James. But in the quiet spaces between candlelight and council chambers, other names fluttered like moths, names that had been buried, names that should have stayed dead. Edward Stafford knew this was his last opening. The Queen was gone. The shadows that had kept him caged now moved without their mistress. James of Scotland had a claim, yes, and the backing of Protestant lords, but Edward had something James did not. He had England in his blood. Not just royalty. Tudor royalty. He stood before a mirror the morning of the proclamation, staring at his reflection not as a man, but as an argument. His face was leaner now, his eyes lined, but still, there was something of Henry there. The brow. The mouth. The same mixture of command and hunger. If he stepped forward now, demanded recognition, the realm would have no choice but to reckon with him. He took up his old name again. Edward Stafford, son of and Weston. Grandson of Henry VIII. He penned letters to sympathetic nobles, those he had studied for years. Hinted again at his parentage, this time not with jest, but quiet fire. Promised stability, an English future without foreign kings. Some replied cautiously. A few with genuine interest. A handful with outright rejection. One, though, invited him to speak. A man of power, proximity, the Earl of Suffolk. They met beneath the bleached bones of Ely Cathedral, where prayers clung to stone and cold air made the words crackle. "You come as a prince," the Earl said, "but England is tired of princes. It wants peace." "I can give it peace," Edward answered. "Better than a foreign heir raised in another court." The Earl looked at him, long and without expression. "You have your father's pride," he said. "But not his reach. Do not mistake shadow for influence." It was the beginning of the end. Within a week, men in royal colors knocked on his door. No trial. No confrontation. Only a sealed message from King James's secretary declaring him a threat to succession and a master of deception born from bastard blood. He was to be removed quietly, for the good of the realm. He did not fight. Instead, he retreated once more, not to exile, but to the estate where he had first learned the weight of silence. They thought he would fade. And for a time, he did. Years passed. And in those years, England changed. James grew older, bloated with suspicion. Then came Charles. Then war. Then a nation cracking along the fault lines that Edward had traced decades before. No one remembered him. Not in the pamphlets. Not in the speeches. But there are records. A visitor in 1642. A pamphlet printed without author, denouncing Stuart tyranny in language that eerily mimicked Edward's own style. A rumored letter passed to Cromwell, referencing a son of Henry still living in secret. And then, silence again. No grave exists for Edward Stafford. No monument. No date of death confirmed. Only a line in a parish registry, asterisk a gentleman, unknown, passed from this life in the winter of '43. kept few visitors, spoke little, eyes full of storms, asterisk. He died as he lived, as a question, never answered. A ghost walking among kings. And the cruelest irony was this: England may have been spared a tyrant by forgetting him. Or it may have lost its last true monarch. Because those who knew him, those few who dared speak his name after death, remembered a man who was brilliant, patient, unyielding, but also distant, hardened, capable of immense cold. One servant said he once watched Edward spend hours watching a fox struggle in a snare, never freeing it, never killing it. Just watching. It was like he wanted to understand its pain, the man said, or measure it against his own. There are stories the nation tells itself, tales of glory, triumph, providence. Then there are those it hides, tucks away beneath centuries of dust and ceremony, where even the cobwebs forget their shape. Edward Stafford became one of those stories. But he did not vanish. Not entirely. In the decades following his death, rumors persisted like rot beneath polished wood. A child born to a servant in Shropshire bearing red gold hair and a birthmark shaped like a crown. A coded diary discovered in the walls of a crumbling manor, filled with entries on Tudor succession and the weight of stolen blood. An anonymous manuscript, buried in the Bodleian, questioning whether Elizabeth truly died without issue, or if her brother did. These whispers became less about Edward and more about what he represented. The idea that the royal bloodline, once so meticulously guarded and cruelly severed, had never truly ended, merely changed shape. Lost its name. Fled into silence. The monarchy never acknowledged him, of course. To do so would have been to unravel too many tapestries. But in private, in footnotes and margins, some historians began to circle the name. Carefully. As if afraid to wake something. One described him as the last Tudor echo. Another, more candidly, called him a threat more dangerous for having done nothing, because nothing implies infinite possibility. But who was Edward Stafford really? He was not merely a forgotten heir. He was a child built in secrecy, shaped by abandonment, made cunning by necessity. Raised in a world that denied him love and offered only knowledge in its place. He became intelligent, yes. Strategic. But also hollowed, like a vessel never quite filled. He understood people only in how they could be used. And power not as a responsibility, but as a form of revenge. He never murdered. He never seized. He never incited war. But he knew how to destabilize with a glance, to unmake certainty with a rumor. His silence was not passive. It was weaponized. Was he a victim? Perhaps. But what if the boy they forgot became the man they should have feared? What if the cruelty done to him, the erasure, the neglect, did not breed empathy but something far colder? What if, by leaving him in the margins, England created something darker than a tyrant, a ghost with no kingdom, no end, and no absolution? To imagine Edward living longer is to court discomfort. Because his patience was legendary. And had the political climate shifted, had a war broken differently or a king died younger, he might have seized his moment, not with an army, but with a whisper. With a forged lineage and a loyal circle. With a name painted in legitimacy and wrapped in vengeance. And then what? Would England have cheered its native son? Or bowed to a stranger cloaked in their own history? In the end, Edward remains an enigma. A life unclaimed, a title unspoken, a power unrealized. But perhaps that was the greatest trick of all. Not becoming king, but making history flinch at the thought that he could have. He did not need a throne. He only needed to be remembered. And now you know. What would you have done in his place? Kept silent? Fought? Burned it all? Would you pity him or fear him? Would you call him forgotten? Or would you say he chose the shadows? Either way, one truth remains. There was once a prince of England whom no one mourned. And that silence was deafening.